Today, we kick off a new sermon series, as I said before, called Generous Living. But as we begin, I do not want any of you, and I'm going to say this each and every week, whether you're here every week or you're visiting, I do not want one person to get the wrong idea or misconception of what this is about. This is not, I repeat, not an attempt to manipulate in any way for you to give more money to the church. It is not. It's the farthest thing from that. This sermon series is really not even about giving it all to Jesus, or giving it all in your offering, or giving it to special needs around our faith community. This is not what it's about. And many people that do what I do even shy away from giving or a generous life because they don't want to seem like they're preaching for their salary, if you will. But here is what it is about. Psychologists and psychiatrists agree that people who live a generous life have less stress, have more content and purpose in their life. They are more happy, if more happy is a word, and they tend to live a life more fulfilled. Basically, people who are generous, they will tell you, have a 30% better life than those people who are not. I mean, your life and my life may be pretty great right now, but who wouldn't want 30% better? Who wouldn't? And generous living actually is not about the act of giving, but it's more of an attitude, if you will, more than anything else. I mean, people who live a 30% better life, who are generous, really never see themselves as giving because it's kind of just who they are. It's a way of life. It's an attitude. It's not a single act. And those who are generous also don't just give to one entity or don't just give one thing. I mean, they give money, they give time, they give their gifts, they give their talents, and they give abundance of other things. They give to churches. They give to other nonprofit organizations. They give to outreach and other ministries. They give to things in their community, their family, in a various number of places. And it's not just money that we're talking about. So if you can't just set that aside. Because my prayer for the next 4 weeks, that as we approach a time of Thanksgiving, when we sit around with our families and we reflect on what we're thankful for, if we can focus on how we can adjust our life just a little bit and be more generous, and maybe strive to achieve 30% better life. And even if you incorporate or buy into just half of what we'll cover over the next 4 weeks, hey, it's 15% better. That ain't bad either. If you don't get all 30, just 15% better. But my other prayer is that during this series is to maybe give you a better theological understanding of exactly what a generous life is all about. There's a connection. It's a strong connection. There's a very spiritual aspect in giving. And Jesus teaches a lot about giving. And anyone can have a generous life without having Jesus in it. They can. But you really can't say you're a follower of Jesus or a disciple of Christ and not be generous. It just doesn't work. So today we begin with a story about Jesus, and it's one of the stories that most of us are familiar with, and that it's recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. And one thing when we read the story about Jesus, we need to note when something is repeated in all 4 Gospels. And as my first grade teacher would say, if it's in all 4, she would say, we need to put our listening ears on. Whatever that meant. It's important to note that in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples and Jesus, as we pick up our story, had just found out that John the Baptist had been killed. You can imagine if you had gotten news like that, you can imagine how you would want to just withdraw, how the natural thing would be to stay home and lock yourself away in privacy. I mean, the last thing you would want is to be surrounded by crowds of thousands and thousands of people who are wanting something from you. They've heard this disheartening news of a cruel and violent death of John the Baptist. And withdrawn, and perhaps to be with their grief and possibly to compose themselves for the big task that lies ahead, is where we pick up this story. So I ask, as you turn to the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, as we begin with the 30th verse, I will ask you to put your listening ears on. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. And then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who had saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. And when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, and so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send these people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." Jesus answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half of a year's wages, and are we to go and spend that much money on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." And when they found out, they said to him, "We've got 5 loaves and 2 fishes." Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. And he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And he also divided the 2 fish among them, and they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men only, who had eaten was 5,000. Mark tells us that sometimes we skip over that they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves. And he tells us how many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried on foot to all the towns, and they arrived ahead of them. And sometimes life is just like that, isn't it? I mean, you need a moment to catch your breath, but people still come to you with issues and needs and problems. I mean, the events and people of life demand us sometimes to deal with me. I don't care how tired you are or how you feel. I mean, if you are a parent and a grandparent, you know exactly what this means. Children, especially infants, can care less how your day at work went. They can care less how good you have been sleeping up until 1:45 a.m. in the morning. They can care less how tired you may be. They cry, and you have to deal with them. And some of you may say, "Well, that happens with my spouse all the time." Okay, but that's a different sermon series at a different time altogether. But if you have ever walked into the door of your home, and your spouse comes and hands you a kid and says, "It is your turn," and turns around and walks out, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And here's where the gospel and our real life kind of intersect. I mean, something important being transmitted in the teaching of Jesus. And with life in our face, we sort of tend to rush ahead and we fixate on Jesus' blessing and breaking of the bread. We kind of fixate on the miracle of multiplication, the kind of miraculous thing that happened. And we kind of wonder, if you're like me, how did God do that? I mean, was it like fish falling out? Or was it, how did that happen? And we fix on that. And however, in our haste, I believe we miss a profound truth that Jesus wants all of us to understand. I can remember a story from my childhood that I was told. It was about a mighty warrior. And this warrior was mounted on this magnificent horse, and he was trotting down the road with the sun glistening off his armor. And as he came down the road, everyone, of course, was dividing the crowd and made certain to get out of his way. And he noticed, however, directly in his path, in the very middle of the road, was a small sparrow. And this bird was laying on its back with its feet up in the air. And the warrior drew the reins of his mighty horse, and he halted it, and he dismounted. And he went down to the sparrow and he said, "Are you dead? And if not, what are you doing in the middle of the road with your feet up in the air?" "No," answered the bird, "I'm not dead. I heard that the sky might fall down, and I'm helping to hold it up." And the warrior thundered and shook with laughter. He rolled on the ground and he began to slap his thigh. And at last he wiped the tears from his eyes from laughing so hard. And he said, "You silly, stupid bird! Even if the sky fell down, what difference could you possibly make with those puny, skinny little legs?" "Well," explained the bird, "you do what you can do. You do what you can do." You see, generous living begins here. We do what we can do. The gospel story of Mark tells us that the disciples ascertained how much food there was. And Jesus took the food, He blessed it and broke it, and He gave it back to them. And under Jesus' direction, they passed it out to the hungry crowd. The disciples did what they could do. The young boy did what he could do. Jesus did what he could do. And we forget sometimes that in the hands of God, in the hands of Jesus, a little is enough. I mean, if you take any of the clutch of activities that might run under this umbrella that we call a faith community, or anything under the rubric of a faithful discipleship. If you take our stewardship giving, if you take our sharing of our times and talents, if you take teaching in Sunday school, or if you take perhaps volunteering to serve the poor at the food bank or the friendship meal, or if you possibly take time out of your day, unannounced, and just go visit someone in our faith community that can't make it here each and every day. You see, faithfulness lives not in these genius and some great skill, but faithfulness to God begins when we do what we can do. It's the mystery of faith. In all who are engaged in doing what we can do, they discover Christ's divine presence and blessings when we're just doing what we can do. I mean, in the hands of Jesus, a little is enough. It truly is. Before God called me in the full-time ministry, as many of y'all know, I worked at a residential treatment facility as a counselor. And part of these young men's therapy and way of life, they had rules, of course, and they had roles. And one of the things they did, and it was part of a behavior modification, if you will, before they did anything, they would sit down in a group and they would put expectations of how they would behave. And then after the event, they would go and they would evaluate themselves on, how they actually did on their expectations. Sometimes it would be, we're not going to punch anybody, during this time. I mean, it was very simple. And each had a role that they had to do. And there was a young man in my unit that was 16 years old. And he was never taught how to use eating utensils. Never. And what he would do, he never learned to eat with a fork or a spoon or a knife. And what he would do is he would take 2 pieces of bread and he would put everything on his plate between those 2 pieces of bread. I mean mashed potatoes, I mean peas, applesauce, spaghetti, meatloaf, whatever. He would put it between these 2 pieces of bread. He would eat it like a sandwich. Because he didn't know how to use utensils. And so the kids in the unit began to laugh at him and make fun of him. So I had the bright idea that I would assign him as the role of what we call the bread man. Okay, now with each meal that the residents got, they got 2 full loaves of bread for the whole unit, and they got peanut butter and jelly with every meal. And the reason is, if they were still hungry, I mean, they're growing 16, 17, 18-year-old men, if they were still hungry after the meal, they could make themselves a PBJ sandwich, or if they didn't like what was being fed that day from the cafeteria, they could always make them a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The bread man was responsible for handing out the pieces of bread as requested. As you can imagine, if you put a loaf of bread on a table with a bunch of 16-year-old young guys that are hungry, half of it's going to be eaten by the first person, or there's going to be a fight that ensues. So, I figured they would either not tease him or laugh at him if he was in charge of allowing them to get pieces of bread. This could have been the most ingenious plan I had ever come up with my part, or it could turn violent and ugly really, really quick. But I will never forget what happened that first day all the way until my very last day. I'll never forget one of the lessons he taught us was the importance of passing bread. He would stand over the table and he would loudly insist that you only took your share, which was 2 slices of bread, to be exact. And that before you went to eat your bread, you had to pass the bread to your neighbor, so that they could get theirs and eat as well. No one told him he had to do this. And it's such a way of faith and a generous life. We share what we have. And in the hands of Jesus, it is all transformed. You see, God never asked us to give up something that we don't already have. You do what you do. You do what you can do. And in the hands of God, a little is enough. And not only is it transforming for others, but for our lives as well. We do what we can do. Because with God, a little is